Welcome to the afternoon session of Voices of the Future. My name's Masrur Ahmed. I'm currently second clerk of the House of Commons Science and Technology Committee, and it's a pleasure to be chairing this session. Quickly, some housekeeping. You won't be surprised to hear that there are no fire alarms planned, and I trust everyone knows where their own toilets are. More seriously, if there are any technical issues with representatives, we'll give it a few moments to try and resolve itself. And if unsuccessful, we'll move on to the next representative and come back to those questions at the end. If any of the panelists have technical difficulties, we'll try and get them resolved as quickly as possible. And just a heads up that this session is being recorded. So this afternoon, we have two panels. From 3:30, we have members of the Science and Technology Committee. But first, I'm delighted to introduce Sir Patrick Vallance. Sir Patrick is Government Chief Scientific Advisor, providing scientific advice to the government. Welcome, Sir Patrick. Can I ask you to briefly outline your role and perhaps your own scientific background?
Yes, well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm, as Masrur said, I'm the Government Chief Scientific Advisor. That's a role I've been in for 3 years. In that role, my job is to make sure that the government gets scientific advice right the way across the spectrum. And I head the government science and engineering profession as well, and a network of chief scientific advisors in each department. So I'm trying to put science into policy to make sure that policy can be built on best scientific evidence, and that science is taken into account when people are thinking about policy direction and where that might take us, which is clearly critical and has been, of course, completely dominated by COVID in the past year. My background is that I was an academic clinician, so I was a practicing doctor and an academic, professor of medicine at UCL. And then I left UCL and went to join the private sector. I was head of research and development for GlaxoSmithKline, a pharmaceutical company, where we made lots of medicines and across all sorts of disease areas. I was there for 12 years, and then I joined government as the Government Chief Scientific Advisor.
Great, thank you very much. We'll now move on to questions. And first up, I think we have Dr. Ed Roberts. Ed is from the RSE Young Academy of Scotland. Ed.
Thanks. Over the last year, we've witnessed an enormous global effort leading to the production of several effective vaccines for COVID-19. What lessons can we learn from this experience about regulation and engaging public and private partners in order to address other global health issues?
That's a great question, Ed. And it is miraculous what has happened. I mean, up until this year, the shortest time period that anyone really made a vaccine was about 6 years, and the average time period was a decade or longer. So something that you don't know you can do, because most vaccine projects fail, was actually done multiple times within a year. And the reason that that happened was, first and foremost, there was a very clear driving objective, which everyone was focused on. We had to get some vaccine for this disease. But it was a remarkable combination of academic, small company, big company, regulators, manufacturing, alignment. And you don't often see that. And I think it's interesting how much was done in parallel that would normally be done in series, how engaged the regulators were from the very beginning, so that they were helping guide the program, saying this is the type of thing I'm going to need to see if I can make this an approved product. Small companies and big companies teamed up very quickly in order to make this happen, because much of the innovation was coming from small companies or from academia, and the big companies then docked into that to make sure that that could be done at scale and at quality and in the way it needs to be done to get products out. And it was a remarkable alignment. And there was also an enormous amount of data sharing. People were sharing information quite widely and still are doing so. And I think all of those are incredibly important lessons for the future. And if you can do it for COVID, why can't you do it for other diseases? And I think there's a real lesson in there going forward about working together, about public-private partnerships, about involvement of regulators early on, about thinking about issues that sound as though you don't need to worry about them at the beginning, but you certainly do in areas like this, which is manufacturing, which is often where there's a big stumbling block. And I think, the CEPI organization, Centre for Epidemic Preparedness Innovation, has thrown down a good challenge, which is it took 300 days for this virus. Can we get it down to 100 days? What would it take to get that down to 100 days? And then the question is, why can't we do that more for other diseases as well, non-emergencies? So I think it's opened a whole interesting area that needs to be explored.
Thank you. Ed, anything to follow up on?
No, thank you. That was fantastic.
Great, thank you. We'll move to Dr. Alice Burton. And Alice is representing the British Society for Immunology.
Hi, thank you. So the COVID-19 pandemic has highlighted the importance of having people with a scientific background within the government and in policymaking roles. What could the government be doing to encourage and facilitate scientists to move into policymaking and politics?
Yeah, another great question, Alice. And just to sort of refer back to the previous question as well, one of the reasons in the UK that we got into such a good position on vaccines was exactly that point of making sure that we had specialists. And in the vaccines task force, what we did was to bring in people with real content knowledge who understood everything from manufacturing processes through to the initial discovery processes in order to make sure that this was being driven by expertise, because it's not a generic procurement problem. There are all sorts of things that we knew were going to happen. Making a vaccine is difficult. Things are going to go wrong. You're going to need technical expertise to correct them. And so the vaccines task force was a huge illustration with a very specific mission of why having expertise and scientific knowledge can really benefit. But in a way, that's a very obvious one because it is a technical problem. The challenge is, I think, that we need more science, engineering, technical expertise right the way across the board in government, because almost every decision has some scientific element to it. And one only has to think about your own lives, how we move from place A to B, how we seek healthcare, how we communicate with each other. Everything is based on science and technology in some way or another. And therefore, most decisions that government has to take will have some element. Many people will not recognize that element, and therefore you need scientists and engineers at the table who can say, actually, there's something here that's relevant that you might not have thought of, and to bring a different way of thinking to the table. So in a sense, it's a form of diversity in the decision-making process as well. So how do we do that? If we look at the current makeup of the civil service, there's rather few science and engineers by comparison with other backgrounds, and so we need to start bringing more people in, and there are several ways that that can happen. There's a science and engineering fast stream, there are internships which bring people in, and I'm trying to increase the intake generally across all of the fast stream and indeed in other places as well. But bringing people in isn't enough. You then need to make the environment right for those people to succeed, and they can succeed either as specialists, which we do need. So there's some areas in government where you do need deep technical specialists and laboratory specialists. But you also need areas where you just need scientists to be part of the process. And you need areas also where you need scientists, not because you need scientists, but because actually they will just think about things differently. So we need all sorts of different scientists across, and that's what I'm pushing on, and many others are too. And to make sure that we help use that as a way of being part of a transformation of how the civil service and government thinks and works. You can imagine how that can be useful for things like increased data visualization tools and so on in decision making. And so I think this is a really critical area. And it's one of the things before COVID that I was working on quite hard, how we would increase this across the civil service. COVID has, in a sense, brought this to very sharp focus that it's necessary. And it's certainly something I'm picking up again now as I can see a bit of light at the end of the tunnel on COVID.
Thank you. Alice, anything to come back on?
No, I think that's spot on. I think it's Also just important to consider how we're making all of these opportunities, such as internships and stuff, accessible for everyone, so that we've got diversity across the board.
Absolutely right. And, you know, we need, all of the problems that we tackle are really difficult problems. And how do you tackle a really difficult problem? You have the most diverse mindsets you can on it, from different backgrounds, different experiences, different training, different disciplines. All of that's important if we're going to tackle these big problems. So I really agree with that.
Thank you. So Patrick, just on that, chief scientific advisors in each department, how do you think how do they feed into the department and the general policy going forward?
Yeah, so pretty much every department has a chief scientific advisor, and the vast majority of them are pulled in from outside government. So they're people who've had careers in academia or research-based industry in some form or another. Some are civil servants who've come up who happen to have a scientific training as well, but most come from outside, and they're for a fixed period mostly. So they're here for 3 or 5 years, and they bring, as a result of that, a big outside-in influence to government is the first thing. They generally come with very good networks, so you've suddenly got access to a very wide range of experts who can come in. I've been focusing on making sure that they also act as a network in government, because we have chief scientific advisors from social science, astrophysics, mathematics, chemistry, all sorts of different areas. And so we have people who can then act as a resource for the rest of government at a senior level. And they tend to be then very influential in their departments. And what we need to do is to make sure they've got the teams underneath them in order to give the critical mass to be influential across departments. But the chief scientific advisors, I think, are a very key part of the process, key part of the system. It's also rather important, I think, that they come from outside, not only because of the different backgrounds and experience they bring in doing so, but also because if you're there for 3 years, you are, and then for most of these people, this is not their career defining moment. They are quite able to make comments and make observations and make interjections without fear that somehow their career's going to suffer. And I think that sort of ability to be independent and to be able to say things which are difficult for people to hear is a critical part of the job.
That's very interesting. Thank you, Patrick. We'll move on to the next question, Almudena. And Almudena is representing the Nutrition Society. Almudena.
Thank you for the opportunity. My question is, what new approaches can be and are being taken to address the prevention of disease and the promotion of health from an early age?
Thanks, Almudena. And that's a little bit outside my remit in this role, but I'm going to tackle it anyway because it's an area that I've thought about a bit over the years. First thing to say, and you will know this coming from where you come from, that there's quite good evidence that many disease patterns and other things are actually programmed quite early in life from exposure to different diets and so on, can have quite lasting impact. So it's very important that we think about this as a life course issue, not as just a simple thing that can be done at any point. So whilst I will say without any worry that it's true that at all stages of life, it's important to think about diet and to think about exercise and to think about things that matter. There is something particularly important, I think, in childhood about doing this. And many people are looking at this. There have been reports, and you may well have seen one. There was quite a big influential report, both from the Chief Medical Officer and actually one from the Government Office for Science on obesity a number of years ago, which really raised the point about where you need to start intervening. And the point about tackling something like obesity is it's not easy, and B, it's a whole systems problem, which involves many different influences ranging from things like the calorific intake of certain food types that may or may not stimulate further appetite suppression or not. So the food type you have becomes quite important in this, through to all sorts of behavioral issues, through to things like advertising and pricing and all sorts of complex areas that can play into all of these areas. So this is a very difficult, long-lasting problem. And we know from the past year where the biggest risk factor for COVID is age, but another risk factor, which has been important all the way through, is obesity, and that the UK has a rather high level of obesity compared to some other countries, and that's almost certainly been a factor in some of the poor outcomes that we've seen. So this is a really important health issue. Nutrition in children is crucial. And there are many groups that think about it, particularly in the Department of Health and Social Care. What are the measures that one can take that might assist with getting appropriate diets at the appropriate age? And we live in an era where for most people, and of course this is not true across the board in England anymore or the UK, but for most people, food availability is no longer rate limiting. It's not the thing that stops you, and therefore there are all sorts of other factors that play in. But we also need to remember now there is a situation that for a number of children in the UK, food availability is actually the issue. So we've got a separate problem of undernutrition in certain groups that we really need to worry about as well. And this issue of inequality in relation to food is also going to be important, particularly in childhood. Well, I'll come back to you. What else do you want to come back on, Almudena?
Yeah, that was a great answer. Thank you very much. So my question, so now the society is focused on disease treatment, but focusing on early childhood would also help prevent diseases later in life. That's why I asked the question, but yeah. Yeah,
it is.
Thank you.
You're absolutely right, and I'm sure you'll be aware there was a lot of work by somebody called David Barker that led to the Barker hypothesis that that, as it was so called, about programming in early life, and it's why concentrating on that's such a crucial part of this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. We'll move on to our next representative, Elizabeth Driscoll. And Elizabeth is representing the Royal Society of Chemistry. Elizabeth.
Hello. So before I ask my question, I just want to say thank you for the time and opportunity to ask this. So my question relates to what I've kind of came across during my PhD, which is sort of batch education and engagement. So to the point, so the government plans to phase out internal combustion engine vehicles, and there's a move to electric vehicles. So what steps could the government be taking to convey the science and value of electric vehicles to the wider public and build awareness of the need for new technologies?
Yeah, a great question again, Elizabeth. And I'm going to start by saying I'm not a communications expert, so I'm not going to be able to tell you what the government should do in terms of its communication plan, but I will make some general observations on that question. The whole target of net zero by 2050 is phenomenally challenging. It is a really big challenge, but it is an essential one for the world. Now, the UK probably has something like 1% of the world emissions, so us doing it alone isn't going to matter, but us doing it matters, because if we do it, we can show a way that others can. And of course, we're all in this together, and you can see people will learn from each other. So it's crucial that we tackle this. It is a systems problem. It's not something that can be solved by individual singular actions. Ultimately, there are a series of interconnected things, some of which can play in the opposite direction to the way you think they're going to. So, for example, land use is an important part of the whole net zero thing. And there are many things you could think about using land for. They don't all pull in the same direction, and they can have unintended consequences. So there are all sorts of things in here that we need to think about. And I'm going to get around to your question now, which was around EVs. it's pretty clear that we're going to have to stop the internal combustion engine and that we need to move to electric vehicles. And you can see the pace at which innovation is now occurring. And actually, in the past, all sorts of things like performance of the cars, cost, inability to go very long distances and so on, were all things that made people cautious. Plus, there's a natural behavioural caution to say, I don't want to be the first person to try something, I'll wait till it's a bit more out there. Now, I think that's changed quite a lot, and we're seeing quite very fast pickup actually across the world in this. And so I think consumers are beginning to see already, yes, I quite like to do that. And so in the EVs, I'm much less concerned about this as an area than some other areas of net zero, because I think it's happening. And I think it's happening because the innovation's been great. The cars are pretty good. I mean, some of them are outstanding. The charging infrastructure is getting better. So that, that's what people care about. Am I going to suddenly be stranded halfway to where I want to go? Can I charge quickly and easily the car? So those sorts of things really matter in this space. And I think that's going to drive uptake of these things. I don't think, in this particular case, it's going to have to be such a big sort of communication sell from government. It's more sort of, is this actually a practical, affordable thing for me to do? And does it work? And when the answer to that's yes, people tend to sort of go to it. In general, they'll go to it if it's cheaper and it's better for them. And that may well be where we get to with EVs. So I think here, that's not such a communication issue. There's obviously some to be done there. But across the whole net zero space, it is huge. I mean, people very often don't realize, for example, that their domestic heating is a major problem here. We've got to think about how to move off gas central heating or oil central heating to something else, hydrogen or electricity or some other form. That's a massive change that we're going to have to try and make happen, and it's not going to be easy. And things like concrete. Concrete is a massive source of carbon emission. What are we going to do for different building materials if we're going to try and tackle this problem? So you can see that the issues here are quite wide. Many of them are technical, but a lot of them are also behavioural. And when we think about all of these, come back to the EVs, the other thing that we might think about doing is simply getting in the car a bit less. Cycling, walking, doing other things, not using those forms of transport, even when we've got an electric vehicle. In our houses, not heating them quite as much as we otherwise would, and making sure that, we maybe put a jumper on or something instead of putting the heating up a bit more. Making sure that we conserve even the electricity, which is, can often be totally clean in some days in the UK with totally renewable energy derived electricity. But I think there's a big interconnected challenge here, of which EVs are one part. But as I say, I think in some ways they are the thing I'm least concerned about at the moment, because I think it's going to happen, and it's going to happen because there's an awful lot of good technology out there which has made it affordable and possible, and will grow as the infrastructure gets better. You may want to come back on that.
No, I think you've actually a really interesting answer, because when I spoke about EVs and sort of all the communication stuff I've done on the side of my research, it's I think that obviously we're heading in the sort of right direction, and I think it's quite exciting to see as a battery scientist. And it's just interesting to see how we tackle these challenges. But I think I totally agree with you that it's just not so much one solution fits it all. And I think that's quite nice to appreciate that there's a bigger picture, there's different solutions, and hopefully we're heading in the right direction. And as you say, we are just like 1% of, say, the problem. So I think it's, for me anyway, because I'm a bit of an energy geek, I think it's exciting to see where we're heading. I suppose one probably question from just what you said is what do you think is the area that's the biggest challenge then going forward in terms of meeting the sort of net zero? Because you mentioned that there's some areas that you're a little bit concerned with, but not so much EV.
Well, so EVs, I think, are on the way. I think domestic heating is a big area that we need to focus on. I think land use, agriculture, I think are areas. I've talked about construction is an area of importance. You've then got to think about things like ships, as well as aeroplanes, which are going to be part of this. And so all of those areas we don't have full solutions to by any means yet. And if you think about 2050, it feels like an awfully long way off. You know, I mean, it feels like so far away you can't think about it. But the truth is, if we're going to make net zero by 2050, many of the things we need to do need to happen in 2026, 2027, 2028 in order to be able to make them fully implemented by the time you get to 2050. So this is not a very distant problem. This is a near-term problem where we need testing of the R&D and the innovation and the things that we could do, and then the uptake to be in place quite early in order to meet our goals. And that, I think, is the big challenge. So this isn't a tomorrow's problem, this is a today's problem.
Yeah. I find that really interesting. I suppose, am I allowed to ask one more question?
Go ahead.
Okay, sorry, it's sort of my train of thought with sort of, you know, today's the bigger picture and that. So this might be out the sort of scope because it is predominantly science, but do you feel, it might be coming back to the communication side of things, do you think there's anything that we should be doing for, say, our current generation? I suppose it's more education, I suppose, as well. Is there anything we should be changing in terms of education? Should we be doing more sort of education, or I suppose influencing, like, how do we live a sustainable life? If that
I don't think we can talk enough about that, actually. I think, you know, it's difficult. I mean, we need to first of all recognize this is difficult. We all live certain lives. Now, we've lived very odd lives over the past year for obvious reasons, but we all live certain lives, and it's difficult to change that. And I think we should discuss that. We should recognize it. And people, I think the vast majority of people in the UK want to do the right thing for the climate. And many people don't actually have a grasp of all the things they can do. They know some of them. And so I think helping all of us understand what are the things that we can do individually that are going to make a difference, and how can we apply that in our lives, I think is critical, and is something that, you know, is going to take many years to get everybody there, but I think it's absolutely worth going for. And I think what we absolutely shouldn't do, and, you know, this feels a bit odd coming from a scientist, but we shouldn't rely on a magic invention that's going to make this easy, because it's not going to be easy. It's going to be difficult, but it's doable.
Brilliant. Just say thank you for that. Sorry, I asked quite a few things and quite a long.
That's great.
I really appreciate this. I'm going to take these. I wrote a few notes. So I'm going to take them back and be like, guys, this is where we're heading. So, brilliant. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. And we'll move on to our next question. I would just draw everyone's attention to the fact that our next two questions are from some of our youngest participants studying their A-levels and representing their schools. So first up, Billy. And Billy is representing Queen's Park Community School.
Hello, good afternoon. How important do you think the promotion of critical thinking is to schools in the UK?
Yeah, thanks, Billy. And I'm always, as soon as somebody says we're now moving to our youngest people, I know I'm going to get the most difficult questions. So thanks, a great question. I'll tell you a story, which I probably shouldn't do because it's being recorded and I'll get into trouble for this. But one of my sons did critical thinking and did it properly and benefited a lot. Another one of my sons did critical thinking at school and decided it wasn't the subject he was going to pay any attention to, and often says to me he regrets it. So the first thing I know from experience is that the people who get the opportunity to do it and don't take it, from my experience of one, is that people may regret it. And I think it is really important, actually. I mean, if you just think about the sorts of decisions that one has to make in government, but then you think about the sorts of decisions that we make in all sorts of areas of life, the ability to understand an evidence base and to interpret that in a way that allows you to draw an understanding from which you can appreciate the certainty or uncertainty of that understanding is really important as a framework. And that's, I think, what critical thinking is helping you to do in all sorts of domains. And in the science domain, of course, one of the critical bits there is scientific skepticism. One of the mistakes, I think, that is often there is that people assume that science is about facts which are immutable. Whereas, of course, science isn't about the information that comes from science so much as the process by which you learn from science. So science is a process to try and understand things, and its starting principle is, I don't know what the answer is. And that's what's so important about it. You start off by saying, I don't know what the answer is, and I'm going to try to do a series of experiments to either usually disprove my idea about what this could be, but occasionally, of course, you end up with generating proof in favor of something which continues to support it. But generally, you're starting out with an hypothesis that you are aiming to disprove in order to add to a body of knowledge. And that discipline of understanding that science is about knowing what you don't know, being prepared to ask the question in a structured way to try to test whether you are right or wrong about something or what you can learn about something, and being prepared to then express that in terms of the residual uncertainty you have, I think is a really important part of the process. And, you know, we've seen it in abundance over the past year, where we started last January with a virus that nobody had ever seen before. And over the course of the year, we've learned an awful lot, and we've got more certain about certain things, but we're not certain about everything for sure. I mean, mostly it's about what we don't know still, and we're still learning. So I think, you know, where critical thinking, I think, comes into play here is the ability to structure your thinking, your questioning, your approach to things, whether that's in a scientific sense or in other domains as well, where you may not have the same experimental methodology to get to your answer. You still have a framework for thinking about where you can take evidence and turn it into something that you can then use as information with an understanding of uncertainties. And so I think, you know, critical thinking is a really key part of general approach to how you approach all sorts of different disciplines. But I'd be interested, are you doing critical thinking?
Yes, I am. Yeah, I'm doing biology, sociology, and psychology, so they are quite more critical thinking based subjects. So yeah, exactly. Yeah,
well, I think so they are indeed critical thinking based subjects, and I think you know, the discipline of critical thinking is one that I think would be is good as a discipline in itself in terms of school education.
Thank you very much for your time. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chitty. And next, we'll go to Cerys, who is representing the Wallington High School for Girls. So I think we have Cerys. Cerys, go ahead, put your question.
Hi, yeah, sorry, I was just struggling to unmute there. I just want to say thank you so much for giving up your time to do this. My question is, in the wake of the increase of conspiracy theories around the COVID-19 pandemic and vaccination programme, how can the government prevent misinformation of scientific ideas?
Yeah, Cerys, thank you. Again, you know, I'm not going to get into the sort of detailed communication side of that because that's not my area, but I think you raise an important point, and it's worth just thinking about, you know, how much of a problem that has and hasn't been. There's no doubt that there's been misinformation right the way across the pandemic that's been there, and it's caused some problems. It's caused often a bleed over into mainstream media as well, and you can see things get hyped up or they get unnecessarily blown down. Most of that sorts itself out. I mean, you know, one of the interesting things about science and ultimately how it, you know, gets portrayed is that science is self-correcting and it sorts itself out, and it will sort those things out as well. But we know that misinformation underlies some vaccine hesitancy. We know that misinformation can underlie resistance to getting testing, may put people off wanting certain sorts of treatments and so on. So it's a real thing, and it's more prevalent in some communities because it's targeted towards specific communities very often. And, you know, and particularly at the moment, it's the vaccine issue, which I think is a concern. And you see untruths coming up and false information, which spreads quite readily. We saw false informations about vaccines and fertility that was complete nonsense and got a hold. And so we live in an era now where these things get a hold very easily. I think the part of the answer to that is to be as open, as clear, and as consistent in the messaging around the true science as we possibly can be, and to keep giving the messages and also to explain, because very often the recipients of misinformation are filling a gap because they haven't understood or been explained the real information. And so explaining things, you know, the reasons behind things, the understanding, I think is important. It helps people get a handle on why they're doing something, why something matters, why something looks as though it's this way. And it also comes back to the point that I was making in response to Billy, which is science has uncertainty. And if we don't recognize and articulate the uncertainty, then it plays into the hands of misinformation. So if you say, you know, I am absolutely certain this is this, and then of course science corrects it and admits, well, it's not quite that actually, it's something a bit different. Conspiracy theorists and misinformation people will latch onto that and make it, okay, it's all uncertain, everything's uncertain, you don't know anything, you got it wrong, and therefore now you can believe me instead. And so I think how we articulate the science is important. Repeated communication, consistency, honesty, openness, these are really important things, and getting everybody talking about it. And all of that said, I think in general, the misinformation has been seen for what it is. And if you look at the vaccine situation in this country, the vast majority of people are taking up the vaccine. The vast majority of people are persuaded by the mainstream scientific information. And I don't think those who set out to cause misinformation will think they've been a success, which is good news.
Yeah, thank you for that answer. That covered a lot of ground.
Thanks, Cerys.
Thank you, Cerys. I guess just on sort of related to what you just said, Sir Patrick, this past year has seen the general public interact with science in a way that they really haven't before. What's been your experience of that, and what do you think needs to happen to sort of carry that momentum forward?
Well, it's great, the level of engagement, actually. And I think, you know, people are genuinely interested in science. I think people have been excited about things like the vaccine production. People have also understood things like the clinical trials that have gone on. You know, various drugs got promoted as being wonder cures, hydroxychloroquine, chloroquine, and so on. People had excitement about them. The discipline of doing a clinical trial and showing that doesn't work, steroids, dexamethasone does work, has been a really important part of this. And I think people get that. And I suspect that's been a lasting change in people realizing you can't just latch on to what you hope is true. You need to do the experiment and find out. And I think it's been very rewarding to have been able to be part of a communication around science and to hopefully, and I think we are seeing this, we've got the generation of people who have been inspired by science, which I think is really exciting. And in fact, that is historically what happened after previous pandemics, that you see a group of young people who get excited by science and what it can do. So I think we've got a lot of opportunity now, ranging from how government itself thinks about and uses science through to a generation of people inspired to want to innovate, be scientists, create knowledge, create understanding, create new products.
Great, thank you, Sir Patrick. A question from Twitter, if I may, from Gareth Moore. The last year has shown the importance of an engaged and empowered research base. How can early career researchers find routes into informing policy, and should more be done to encourage this before the postgraduate level?
Yeah, it should is my short answer to that. I was quite struck by a question that somebody asked me a couple of years ago, which is that we have a degree called Politics, Philosophy and Economics. We don't have one that's called Politics, Philosophy and Science. And I thought that was quite an interesting comment and a question there about, you know, what undergraduate courses should be going. But I think we do need to get younger career researchers into this area. And one of the things that we've actually done during this pandemic is had more early career people involved in various advisory bodies and groups that feed into other bodies. So we've definitely reached out more widely. And I'm at the moment thinking about what structures we might put in place. My colleague in Canada, who's the Chief Scientific Advisor in Canada, has set up what she calls a youth council in advice in Canada, which I think is a really interesting idea that we're thinking about here as well, to try and bring in younger postdocs and other researchers into policy decisions and discussions and advice early on, because, you know, there is a language and an approach to be learned for sure, and I think the more we can engage more people in that, the better. So it's an area that I'm quite interested in. If you've got some ideas about it, please do send them in.
Great, thank you.